Welcome back to another episode of Inside Access Control, sponsored by SIA. Very excited today to have a good friend of mine join me. You might have seen him on the PropTech conference that we did a week ago, and we thought it'd be great to have John Healey join us and talk a little bit more about the topic around ethics. There was a statement he made in the presentation that I thought was wonderful, and it was around this idea of building products that are focused on care versus them being around control, which is, right against what access control is, but makes a lot of sense. And I wanted to dig a little bit deeper, so I thought we'd have John on. John, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thank you.
Of course. So why don't you, before we jump into it, just give a little bit of background again for those of you that didn't see the PropTech show, but just give a little idea of who you are and where you work and what you do.
Sure. Just really quickly, I'm trained as an architect. Though I'm coming from Georgetown University's ethics lab. So I just want to make that very clear. I'm a designer of the built environment and have a bit of experience with IoT and particularly the design of access control systems. I know Lee going back to Brevo days and looking at what happens when we've got phones in our pockets and how that might start to create new relationships that we have with the physical environment, thanks to all the sensors and logic systems in place. So architect, but the past 3 or 4 years, I've been working at Georgetown University's ethics lab, which is a team of philosophers and lawyers, computer scientists, other researchers, students, and one of our main areas of focus is on matters broadly of technology and society. But where we come in is trying to sort of more than build the bridge, but create a pathway for all those really great ideas that you get from your intro to ethics class, and try to jailbreak them out of those classes and into the problem-solving world. So we've developed what we call translational ethics methodologies, which means it's not just sort of theoretical philosophy, and it's not just sort of well thought out ideas about ethics that are then applied to situations, but a way of engaging ethical analysis sort of in the moment of emerging complicated situations, scenarios, decisions, which is kind of all the time, right? We're sort of always, if it's a new decision, we have to kind of reevaluate this stuff all the time. So we're trying to work with folks like myself, designers, to see if there's any design methodology that can infuse into that critical ethical thinking and make it kind of a more ordinary practice, whether you're more of the business mind or engineering mind or design mind. So I should say something about what is ethics? Sure.
Yeah, why don't we do that? So just to frame it properly, so that, because I think that people come in with a preconceived notion of what ethics is or what you're talking about, and my engagements with you, it's broadened my view on exactly what it is. So it's not just all woo-woo, if you would, around the ethics side. There's like actual practical process, and so why don't you define and frame it properly for us?
Yeah, well, hopefully we're keeping that in the recording. I'll put the woo-woo classification of ethics over here. And then I'll also put a sort of misinterpretation of what ethics can be as law or legal compliance. That's certainly a part. But when we talk about sort of moral philosophy as the underpinning of ethics, that's kind of a different animal. And it's actually maybe more familiar to all of us. It's more accessible to all of us because it's really talking about, the principles, the values, the norms that are really important to you or your organization or your community. The idea that other individuals or other organizations and communities might have other sort of sets. And so ethics can even help in thinking about how we kind of negotiate those when those sort of frameworks collide. And maybe that's actually one of the meta subjects for today. But maybe a really simple way of declaring what ethics is and what it's not, besides, like, we're not talking about legal ethics, legal compliance today. When we talk about ethics, we're talking about people. And when we're doing work with our technology intersecting with society, when we're doing our work with computer scientists, mathematicians, engineers, they're used to hearing the human-centered design kind of model or practice. And so there actually are some ways to get that, that human-centered approach to thinking about technological systems enriched with sort of better understandings or more robust understandings of what are the values at stake and what's the role that the tools that we make and put into the world, what their implications are. And I was just listening to a colleague speak, and she said one of the aims of moral philosophy, one of the aims of ethics is, I wrote it down, inculcating a mindset, she used the word inculcating a mindset so that there's a kind of constant practice of a reflective mindset, and noticing how new decisions and situations resonate with the values and norms, or just the expectations that you currently have, and noticing that that's an essential part of the work. And out of all of that, what I really like about it is ethics doesn't happen at the beginning or only at the end. It's something that is part of the entire process, from your backlog grooming to sort of strategic business decisions to, who you're reaching out to do your market analysis, or maybe even more broadly than that. So
yeah, but let me ask you on that, because we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but we can bring it up front now. It reminds me, you could take, in what you just explained there, take the word ethics out and put in user experience, or take the word user experience out and put in, I don't know, legal. You're not like, in an industry like ours in the access control side, which is heavily technical on that case, right? It's sort of, you hear about people, the design process being, A/B testing, and then it jumps to, when we get into subjects like this, more of the legal side, like what do you do with the data, and what's the EULA and what's the GDPR aspects of what you're doing on that end. But what you're talking about is even deeper into more on the just because you can, should you approach to doing a lot of things that, but it's embedded into the entire process, like you talked about. So there's not like, you don't bring like, the ethicist in, or I guess you can, but what you're talking about is that it's a part of a core understanding of how people do work to ask the question. Is that correct?
yeah, actually, it would be nice if you could bring an ethicist in.
Well, I'm not saying you shouldn't. It's just the thought of like, it'd be interesting in your, software development process, you had someone do the filter through it. But at some point, I got to believe in order for this to really take hold, it becomes a normal sort of practice, like the same way you do cybersecurity. Even though you have checks and balances throughout the process, you would probably have the same process, right?
A really helpful way of thinking about the kind of applicability here is thinking about the sort of role that how important the definition of terms is in, say, the development process of a technical system. You really need to get your parameters, things defined, your parameters set. And one of the kind of stumbling blocks, I think, of actually practicing a critical ethical thinking in the process is when you've got a lot of posters around the wall, around your office that say, like, we respect privacy, for example. Critical ethical thinking is looking at, well, hold up, just make sure we all are on the same page of what we even mean by that, because privacy, for example, is pick a term, and it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of people, right? Privacy, for example, privacy from the perspective of, a credential holder or somebody going through some kind of, COVID tech scanning process. They might have a relationship to privacy that suggests, or that's something about an interest in what happens with their medical history data, right? A sort of protection interest. But an engineer at the table who's working on differential privacy, they might be going, yep, totally on board with the privacy. We just need to figure out what the proper value for epsilon is so that we can get our utilization ratio to a functional state, right? But if we don't do that, and that's sort of what it looks like. What do we mean by that? Sort of, sometimes we call them halo terms. Like, we all thumbs up privacy, but it's really important when we're doing work to just make sure that we're unpacking that a little bit, because we might be sort of at the privacy table, but talking different languages to each other.
Oh yeah, that's, I mean, back to the sort of having a level set on terminology and
Right.
somewhat of a broader understanding overall. And I feel like every time you and I have these conversations, it seems to be the type of subject that it's like exercising and any other type of thing where you could feel the muscle around the ethics conversation get stronger the more you talk about it, because it's not necessarily something that you learn like, you know, I do remember there being a business ethics taught in college, but that was more around like not taking bribes
Yeah.
and, you know, doing
Like
things
at
like that.
the last class of your whole curriculum, it's got like 30 contact hours total, and by Wednesday of your first postgraduate internship, you're completely enculturated in some other.
Right. It's just, but it's the philosophies around it, I guess, that I didn't necessarily appreciate as much before. And really, again, unless once you start getting into conversations where you start to level set on understanding and norms and understanding, because some of this is opinions as well, and it's a culture that you're creating within an organization in a lot of ways, because um not saying that I like to believe people are doing more good than bad in a lot of times what they're doing, but even within that, somebody's pure belief of certain things can influence design of stuff. It's not that it's wrong, it just might, that balance has to happen, I believe.
Yeah, another reason to hang out with more moral philosophers or read the books. There's some good like judo flips. So conceptual judo flips. So you just said like it really varies with people's beliefs, and I would say sure, and maybe more helpful to think about is recognizing just that people have different perspectives, right? And they're sort of situated differently in the world, in their company, amongst their family, and people just have different lived experiences. And so sometimes when there is disagreement on what a value is, or even if a value should be prioritized, um, that might have as much to do with just sort of appreciating the situatedness of everyone's perspectives. And actually, we do a lot of work on this, advocating for what's called epistemic inclusion, but just the idea that um, a diversity of perspectives at the table is a way to add value to the creative process, right? That's just fancy speak for like, who's got another idea? Um, and then there's all kinds of ways to um, sort of socialize at that table, right? Like good ways of better practices of communicating and listening and all that. But the first part is just sort of appreciating, yeah, people might have different beliefs that are rooted in their own perspective. And while we're thinking about that, do we have a variety of perspectives at the table, or standing up in this meeting, or sort of gathered in the user surveys or market surveys? Um,
Yeah, question though on that, because so trying to just play, call it devil's advocate on some areas, or reasons why, because I think if you got a group of people together and most of them you said, yeah, we want to do this, it reminds me of like big data. Everyone's like, yeah, I want big data, but you're like, all right, so what about it? And you're like, I don't know, I just want big data. Nobody wants to be the person in the room that says, I don't want big data, that stuff is hooey. Same idea around this, where I think you would get everybody in a group that would say yes, but it doesn't necessarily always happen. And so trying to break that down into sort of tactical ways, I guess, of getting it so it moves beyond the high level conversations and actually into action side. What do you recommend, I guess, as a way to approach it? And if you could bend it a little bit to the access control industry, because that's what you know,
yeah.
how and who the audience is. What are some practical ways that can do it that maybe, because again, sorry, I don't want to go on a tangent here, but like I don't want it to get caught up in the legal side of the ethics conversation where people are afraid, like if we open that door,
Yeah.
who knows, like, what bad could happen, so they just keep it closed. So
Yeah.
what can you do to apply some of this in the access control industry?
Yeah, good. Well, luckily, not only am I not a philosopher, but I'm not a lawyer either, so I wouldn't even dare venture into that side of things. But
Good.
as a designer, I'm in the market for anything that gets my creative juices flowing. How can I think about things in a way that I've never thought about them before? Um, and that type of practice is use that situational word again, but very contextual. Like, what's the problem in front of us that we're trying to solve? What's the concrete material thing that we're trying to aim for, accomplish, do, fix? So we get out of, I think when you say woo woo, it's the super high level in the clouds type of pondering, the meaning of life. But in the access control world, for example, there was a response, some kind of initial response to the COVID-19, and some kind of reflex from the industry to say, hey, we can play a role in this. And that's great. That's a very specific framed moment full of all kinds of new decisions, new contexts that by virtue of them being new, there's a lot of ground to explore. There's a lot of risk and reward to calculate. But how do we even find our way? And how do we even know whether we're going in the right direction for us as an organization? And also not an accountant, so put the accounting side of things off the side. But just is this within our sort of core aim, and how well is our system set up to match these adjacent systems? So you had asked a question back at the PropTech conference about does access control have a permission to sort of respond to this? And I said, absolutely. And I'll just add to that, it's absolutely because not only is it already physically there in the environments that we're concerned about, but it also wields a kind of power, not on its own, but not totally independent, but there is a kind of power to those technical systems being deployed in those environments. And so as a system that wields power, we should pause and go, can that power be used to, up the benefits in a fair, just way, and can it help contribute to the reduction of harms? So absolutely, that becomes a very kind of situated scenario that's ripe for checking in with the values and norms that you would be bringing into the question, or into that scenario. So besides, like, do the lights blink green and red in a way that aligns with your outcomes, but are the values that you're reinforcing through your access control system the same values that are relevant to some kind of health management system? And so that really caught my eye, and I think that's a really interesting leap. I mentioned this at the PropTech panel again. There was a leap there where the access control system, or we were talking about smart access, but the control part didn't leave. So is there a role for control over entry points to also manage the health risks? And I think that's just those are such very different things that one of my first sort of, there might be some ethics there. When we're talking about digital systems in particular, we always start with, what's the system optimizing for? And so what is an access control system traditionally optimizing for? And we could try to define better what property technologies and their response to the COVID-19 situation, what actually is the aim of that? I think that's a little bit muddled, but clarity on what's underpinning that could really help not only the design process, if there is to be an intervention in the physical environment with access control systems, but it also might shed some light on how access control systems might move. You talk about phase change, might move from whatever the current status quo model of the industry is to a sort of next level, to actually smart access, perhaps.
Yeah, I think about that in the way that we talk about where historically the systems were built to keep bad people out, so it inconveniences everybody in order to do that. That when you flip it and introduce technology, is there a way to now in the bad people out before were people that had guns or could do physical harm, to now keeping bad health out or bad things out, right?
Yeah.
That could give harm there too, of how you handle that. And it, the concern, like around the ethics side that I had on that, is the critical thinking that goes beyond of we were very focused on the detection of and the notification of, but then there wasn't a lot of conversations around the okay, then what, like that conversation. Because I feel like if you do spend some more time on the then what side, it could drive some of the practical stuff that we already know that it needs to do, like detection and notification.
Yeah.
And just going through that process, where I also think about, if our systems were built to, like you said, and I love it, like around care, like it's access care versus access control. How would you design and build a system that does that? Which would be things like, I don't know, being very clear on where data goes, and being very clear on around privacy concerns and things. Like, actually a good example in my belief is, like, if you look at the first scanners that they use at the airports right after 9/11, the x-rays, there wasn't like much care put towards when they would take the silhouette of the people and they would do that, of like everyone in the place seeing everything. Like the privacy side wasn't even a consideration, because it was about, we have to bring this hammer and we need this hammer, so we do it. And then you could see, as time went on, the care around controlling some of that just visually, so
Yeah.
that there was a bit of privacy on that end, right? Which is, in
Yeah.
my mind, it's just an example of care.
That's such a great example. It's like it's becoming a classic example now. So are you talking about like the TSA
Yeah, the one
officer's
that you go in that
monitor?
spins around you.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
everyone can see that what the officer, like the control officer, is
Yeah.
looking at, right?
Yes.
So yeah, that seems like fairly problematic for reasons that we can dive into some other time. But what's interesting is if you actually zoom in to the screen that the TSA officer is looking at, there's a few things built into the system, like in the user interface. The first one is 2 buttons, male or female. And no one ever asks me if I'm walking through. I guess they make an assumption and they push the button. Why do they push the button? They push the button because the micro X-ray scanner sort of fits a template, and based on some really binary models of gender, there's different heat maps that you would expect as sort of the norm, right? And so if they push the wrong button, or maybe you don't necessarily fit into one of just 2 buttons, you're going to be flagged because you are an abnormality to the system. And then your experience there means you get to be pulled out of the line, and you get to go through the whole theater of it. You have to explain things if you can, if you want. I don't know, but it's certainly an undesirable experience, right? Based on generated or triggered by some assumptions, some norms, some priorities that were built into the system itself. And you would hate to scale that up. When everybody goes back to work, we amplify that, times 100 million. Because we still haven't solved that. All we've done is be able to sort of point out that there's, often it's called, we refer to like the bias that's built into a technology. But I think for access control, like if it's a data-based company, then you always have to look at bias issues. If it's a type of technology that's doing any kind of predictive analytics, you're using historical data, for example, there's just too many books written that you have to, that's part of your responsibility. I mean, part of your initial responsibility is acknowledging that the social implications of your technology are actually, you are accountable to that as you're thinking about how it goes out into the world, how it works. But thinking specifically about access control beyond just bias, thinking about the framework for this is where the distinctions matter a lot, right? Like back when making the distinction, do we mean privacy like this? Do we mean privacy like that? We also need to, it's helpful to be clear-eyed on the kind of hierarchy or framework of principles, how the different sort of values or important things that you're considering relate to each other. So for example, Ethics Lab team is about to release a white paper on ethical frameworks around administrative data shared for researchers. This is basically just big data sets that go out into the world, and how do you, what are the interests and rights at stake for individuals and groups, including the researchers, but also the data subjects themselves. And one of the things that this consortium of researchers put together was a kind of, it's almost like a cascade, that privacy is sort of one of the core principles. And then other words like confidentiality, that I've heard of as a non-philosopher, and security are kind of subsets or contributing to privacy. So they have a very careful definition of privacy as something about the notion that people may have interests in certain data or information about them as not to be get out into the public domain. The notion of confidentiality then becomes something about almost like a fiduciary role of whoever is working with that data. And the notions of security is, again, kind of like a tactical thing. It's for another podcast to go deeper into there. We have a white paper coming out on ethicslab.georgetown.edu people can dive into. But I was looking at that and I was thinking about just my experience in the access control in the IoT industries and how paramount security is, both in terms of who the technology is sort of in service primarily for, you know, administrators, GSOC operators, that kind of thing. But then the notions of like privacy, I've never once heard about confidentiality in a panel for access control or IoT. So there seems to be an order there that has a big impact. I don't know how an access control system, like a sort of whatever the sort of industry norm access control system that's built around a core principle of security, is able to respond without changes to a real concern for the data subjects, the credential holders, the people walking through the door who may or may not have a fever. You know, how is that system accounting for their privacy? How is that system putting things in place for confidentiality? And I think that's very telling, right? The way you build the system is implicitly full of these values. And so when we start moving into frameworks like health, where we've got a lot of documentation on the rights of patients, we have HIPAA, we've thought a lot about that. I wonder if there's a priority realignment that needs to happen for some of these systems to come play in that space.
I agree.
That sets off a whole creative process, right?
I agree. And I would even say too, it even gets more complex. There hasn't been many thought or conversations around what happens now when you integrate it into other systems as well.
Yeah.
Like it gets even more complicated on that side, which I think, you know, in my, call it now, I think it's 18 years, and probably of those, at least 10 of them have been around partnerships and working with business development side of it. There has not been, outside of indemnity clauses and you know, legaling it up, if you would, around protecting, like, you know, if something happens, I'm not liable. But there hasn't been much in a conversation that happens around, you know, who does what and who does it where and how, and, you know, not much at all.
The liability side of that is just such a bummer, right? It's all about justifications for not tackling the challenges. I think a complete reframing, though, is if there's a business opportunity to be in that space, if it makes sense as a company, there's value, and if there's a real sense that value can be imparted back to the market, you know, I think it's exploring what is that sort of ethical realignment. What does it entail? What would our product look like? How would we change? What would we need to change? something I've kind of bumped into is a lot of hesitance to even sort of go there, like, and sort of almost like a defeatism, right? But I think that's where the sort of ordinary practice of thinking about these questions, making sure we're unpacking what do we mean by that, how does this new problem relate back, might help, because it might just start with a a small team bringing it up at a
Yeah, but that's why, as much as I don't like in some regards regulation in that, but in other regards I do. I mean, it at least creates a watermark that people
yeah
have to meet, right? And then at least there's some basic protection that's built in versus the wild wild west. I got to believe, you see everything that's going on with Facebook and some of these other places, that down the road you don't have to do a lot of mental gymnastics to probably believe that there's going to be some rules put in place that if you if you go into this type of business, there's a watermark you at least have to read, which is like what GDPR is now, right? It's like, it's the basic, and then what I think it's CCA, or the one in California, like those are just those, and it may need to, I think it's going to happen. Like, in my opinion, you see what's going on with like the fever cameras and the thermal imaging and the rest of it, and then all these these applications that a lot on the visitor management side of, you're pre-registering to go into places, and they ask questions like, have you had a fever, is anybody in your house, have you been on an airplane, things like that, that it's going to be a rush for all those things to be implemented, and then there's going to be a pullback at some point, and then it'll be that watermark will get set. That's my, like, right now I think we're oversubscribed, and then it's going to shift back down to where normal is going to feel like, and it's going to look a lot different than it currently does now.
This is where it's an opportunity, I think, for companies to lead, because right now I'm happy to be in academia right now, but it must be a pretty bumpy ride. There's a vacuum right now that we could wait for the laws to form up, but we know that what my philosophy colleagues like to point out is the law tends to be lower than the kind of standard that we tend to think about or aspire our values and goals to be at, right? Think of it, every privacy law tends to be like just slightly below what you would sort of hope for, but it's often then considered just better than nothing. So the idea that the law is there almost as a lower than the low water mark than we would really hope. So that's on the law side. The other situation that we find ourselves in is, some real problems with CDC leadership, institutional leadership like that from the government. We would expect to get clear guidances, directives, and stay focused with and have public trust in groups like CDC. I don't know where OSHA is these days, but they have historically a role to play here. So in the meantime, the companies, local municipalities are making it up as we go. The state of Virginia, just a couple of days ago, announced a set of criteria. It's a little bit more full-throated than just guidance and loose recommendations on how different physical environments need to get set up and what their protocols for operation are. And in their announcement, they explicitly call out the normal institutional channels here are silent, or muddled or confused. So this is where, as an organization, as an advocacy group, as a company, if you have a good sense of sort of what you're really good at, what your priorities are, and how those priorities align with a health crisis, a matter of public health, greater social good, it's not like this virus is just attacking your property, right? It's happening in a much broader sphere. And so that's actually one of the other complicators too of our current situation, right? We're used to sort of controlling a single physical environment like a castle, but we're fighting against community spread of a virus that's transmitted through aerosols, and your neighbors are in it with you too. And so when you don't have the laws, when you don't have the institutional leadership, you need to figure out a way to tap into your own sort of ethical compass and find a way through. And it's not just, and this kind of gets me to some recommendations. It's not just like we really understand our definition of privacy or health. It's also going back to one of your initial things where it's a diversity of beliefs or perspectives or interests we have to be mindful of. And so I made a call for this at the PropTech panel. There needs to be some partnerships formed, because access control companies are access control companies, but they need to become an ally. They need to form some solidarity with the larger world. They need to have more perspectives at the table. They need to understand what the complicated dynamic risks and benefits are. They need to understand how, if we're talking about public health, we're talking about sort of equitable benefit there. So you need to make sure that your system doesn't disproportionately impact some people versus others. So there's a lot of, I say, like growing the table and adding more chairs, seeing if you're able to participate, but it's a big social act. And that's an ethical move, to notice that there's more people than just the folks that are in your company that are really important to getting this right, and that your particular offering is working within, I think Bridget was from Wilco was talking about this, the both the technical ecosystem as well as the social ecosystem. And you would do that not because it feels good, although sometimes it feels good to work with more people and get some diversity of perspective, but because it's really smart. It's a way to get new ideas into the hopper. You know, you can start to really lead in your community, in the industry. You know,
I really like the public health. So this sort of bringing in different people, it makes me think like I'm going to reach out and look at the who on public health would be some people that sort of build some bridges. And I mean, that's like the purpose of this, is to hopefully show that it's approachable. It's not this, you know, weird thing that sits on the outside. And it could be, and there's people in the space that want to integrate and have a conversation and be at the seat at the table. And it probably starts at the board level and works its all the way down. But I also think just at the, you know, at any level within the organization, bringing in the thoughts, even if it's just reading a book on it and trying to spark the conversation, would be a good place to start.
Lee, can I add there, I still keep in touch with the world of architecture, and I'm seeing a lot of projects, a lot of sort of consultative efforts for architecture firms to go, you know, also, you know, ask how can we help. And I'm hearing, you know, even kind of locally, when there's outreach to the municipalities, hey, can we connect with whoever your public health agency are there representatives that we can interface with? As much as, say, access control companies don't necessarily have these bridges already built, it's very likely that the municipalities or whoever is the sort of trusted public authority in this space, they also don't have those bridges built. And they could use help. And so I wouldn't expect there to be like an easy path to just make that happen, but I think it's worth the effort. Again, selfishly as a designer, I think you would design better stuff. And one of the takeaways from all of this is, I brought this up because it puts the kind of regular notion of an access control system into a new light, right? We'll call it a ambulance flashing red light. Hopefully that flashing red light calms down, goes away at some point in the future. What are the access control systems, the regular access control systems going to be? And I would hope that there's an opportunity to learn from this, that starts to look at access control systems as systems of care for, you know, the security administrators that they're selling to, but also for the notions of credential holders and visitors. I think like hospitality kind of gets a lot of that right. They think about the kind of whole person experience, um, inhabiting spaces that are being controlled and managed by these systems. But I wonder if it should go further. You know, the health scenario makes me wonder about, you would want your medical records back, right? If you got a red light today because the health screening thing failed you, you would want to know why. You would demand to know why. Why can't I go to that really important meeting that I must attend or I'll get fired? If they didn't tell you, that would be weird, right? Coming back to kind of a regular offering, I wonder if there's some relationship to the data and to the system that the credential holders have, or the visitors have, or that people who are denied, if they have a different kind of relationship to the system, if the managers of the system had a different relationship with those folks.
You're going to need to. I mean, I think in a lot of these places that if you're using these systems and let's say, I fly all the way over to some place for a job interview, or I go in for my job and then I get denied because of some false positive, or maybe I did have a higher temperature. Having those systems in place that follow the afterwards of like, well, so then what do you do? And who does it? Because it may not be the person that's working the front desk that to be the person that needs to work with somebody to explain that to them, right?
Right.
And so because if say that's outsourced to a security guard company, they may not be trained in how to do that, right? So maybe they need to be. I don't know, but it just makes me think that my hope is that these conversations continue and we can do that. On that note, I think this is a good probably point for us to stop now, and hopefully we'll continue to have this conversation even more. I can, you and I talk about this all the time, so we could go forever. But if people want to find out more information, where's the best place for them to go?
I think they should start with ethicslab.georgetown.edu, or you can ping me, Jonathan Healey, at LinkedIn, and love to hear from folks doing it.
Awesome. All right. Well, John, thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. And it's an important subject that hopefully this is just the beginning of many more. So thank you.
Thanks, Lee.
No problem.